In the name of the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit, one God, Amen.
Blessed season. Tomorrow is Jonah's fast. And today's gospel actually is a continuation from the gospel in Vespers. And there's a lot of similarities between what Jonah did and what Christ did. But there's also a lot of differences. They both fled, but very differently and for very different reasons. And one is highly praised and the other fleeing is not. Jonah fled, but maybe there's three questions that can show the difference between how Christ teaches us to flee and how Jonah flees. The three are: from what is he fleeing, why is he fleeing, and to where is he fleeing? For Jonah, from what is he fleeing? The first part of Jonah, there's a phrase that repeats a lot, especially in Hebrew, min lifnei Elohim, which means from the face of God. You'll see a lot in Hebrew. In English, it doesn't translate as well because it doesn't really make sense. But we use that same phrase in Psalm 50. Psalm 50 has that as the presence of God. You cast me away from your presence, or you cast me away from your face. So what was Jonah running from? He was running from the presence of God. He was running from the presence of God. Some people do that sometimes. They just run from the presence of God. The presence of God becomes too much to them. It's almost like turning on the light right when you wake up. It's too much. When we start going into darkness, the presence of God becomes hypersensitive to us. And you'll notice people, when you ever bring the name of God, they become uneasy. When they come into church, they feel uncomfortable. Because there's a certain darkness there that light shines on. He was running from the presence of God. In Proverbs, it tells us, the wicked flee when no one pursues, but the righteous are bold as a lion. The wicked flee when no one pursues. God is not even judging them or anything right now. He's literally standing with open arms, but they're running away from him. Why? Because there's some wickedness, there's some darkness, there's something that the light is just too much for them. We do that sometimes. So Jonah was running from the presence of God. That's what he was running from mainly. Why was he fleeing though? Why was he fleeing? Maybe there's some historical context that we need to kind of go over real quick. God told Jonah to go to Nineveh and to tell them that he will destroy the city in 3 days if they don't repent. Or actually, he will destroy the city in 3 days because of their sins. Now, Nineveh was the capital of the Assyrian Empire. The Assyrian Empire were known to be ruthless. They did not like foreigners at all. They used to torture foreigners. They used to be very hostile to foreigners. They dishonored any religion that was not theirs. They were known to be tyrants to foreigners. They were known. The empires that came afterwards, they kind of learned. The Babylonian Empire was a little bit more lax. And then eventually the Persian Empire that came after was very, very relaxed. You can worship whoever you want. You can talk whatever language you want as long as you pay your taxes, don't do trouble. But the Assyrian, that first great empire, were very, very ruthless. They did not like foreigners. So think about this. God is telling Jonah, you know that city over there with those people that don't like foreigners? Yeah. The city that doesn't really respect any God except for that what they worship? Yeah. The city that tortures and kills people that come and preach there? Yeah? Yeah, I want you to go there and tell them about your God. Tell them you're a foreigner. Sounds like a suicide mission at first. Sounds like a suicide mission. But the crazy part is, Jonah did not run because he was scared. Not at all, actually. Jonah did not run because he was afraid. He ran for a completely different reason. He tells us actually in chapter 4, he says this. Jonah became angry. He prayed to the Lord. Isn't this what I said, Lord, when I was still at home? That is what I tried to forestall by fleeing to Tarshish. I knew you are a gracious, compassionate God, slow to anger and abounding in love, a God who relents from sending calamity. He tells him, that is why I tried to forestall by fleeing to Tarshish, because I knew you were a gracious and compassionate God. It's the most confusing thing ever. So at the beginning, he's running away from the presence of God. Why? Because God, you're too good, you're too compassionate, you're too nice. Very conflicting, very confusing. If someone is good and nice and gracious and opening his arm, wouldn't you run towards him? God is standing there literally with open arms. And you know this, you're saying it. Wouldn't you run to him? But instead, he actually ran from him. It's a very confusing, very conflicting thing. But it's clear that there were some negative emotions within Jonah. He did not think that the Ninevites deserved God's mercy. He was actually angry that God was merciful to them. How could you be merciful to those people? or there was some hatred. He did not really love the Ninevites the way that Christ taught us to love. There were some negative emotions, and those are the ones that usually block the relationship between us and God. Negative emotions, whether it's lust, whether it's hatred, whether it's anger, whether it's envy, whatever it is, they usually make things very, very illogical. God is there, literally opening his arms. Jonah himself is saying, you're gracious, you're compassionate, so I'm just going to run the other way. Makes absolutely no sense. But sometimes, unfortunately, we do the same thing. Now, to where was he fleeing? He was fleeing to Tarshish. There's a few, actually, interpretation of where Tarshish is. Some people think it might be Tarsus in Syria, some people. But I think the vast consensus think it's Tartessos in southern Spain, which at that point in history was like the furthest point known on the map. So Jonah literally got in a boat and went as far away possible from where God told him. He's literally running exactly the opposite from God, exact opposite. And in here, when you look at the entire picture, you see the confusion. He's running from the presence of God. Why? Because God is too good, he's too gracious. That's literally the reason that he gives. And where is he going? He's going as far away from God as he could. Very illogical. Very illogical. Now, Christ, in this gospel, he also flees, but for a completely different reason and a completely different manner. This gospel actually was the first gospel when I was here, when I came back last year. I remember it because Abuna Daniel gave the sermon that Sunday, and his question was, what are you seeking? What are you seeking? And it was actually a really good sermon. It's in Arabic. If you guys, it's probably still on YouTube if you want to look at it. But that question, kind of any confusion that's there, it kind of like puts a spotlight on it. What are you seeking? And Christ knew exactly his mission. He knew exactly what he's here to do. And it's very clear from this gospel. The gospel today actually is a continuation from Vespers, and it's John chapter 6. John chapter 6 begins with the breaking the 5 loaves and 2 fishes, blessing the 5 loaves and 2 fishes. And then after that, what we read in Vespers, the people were so impressed that they wanted to come, take Christ, and forcefully make him a king. Verse 15 tells us this. Therefore, when Jesus perceived that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, he departed again to the mountain by himself alone. He ran away to the mountain. He knew what they were coming to do. He didn't really want anything to do with it, and he ran away to the mountain. Eventually, people come the next day, and they only find his disciples. And his disciples are about to go into the boat and cross the sea or the lake. But Christ wasn't with them. People, they split up. Some people start looking for him. Eventually, they find him on the other side. And they come, and they ask him, when did you get here? There was only one boat, and the disciples went on. You weren't on it. How did you get here? Christ actually ignores the question completely. He tells him this, you seek me, not because you've seen the signs, but because you ate the bread and you were filled. You have alternative motives. So Christ fled. He fled from the people. So let's ask the same 3 questions. From what is he fleeing? Christ was literally fleeing from a group of people who do not share the same vision as him, who do not share the same calling as him. They had a completely different agenda. They wanted to force something onto him that was not part of his mission. He was running from, the honor of the people, vainglory, pride, arrogance, whatever you want to call it. St. Mark the ascetic tells us this. Guard your mind from self-praise. Flee a high opinion of yourself, so that God does not allow you to fall into the opposite of virtue. For man does not accomplish virtue alone, but with the help of God who sees all. So Christ was literally running away from the vainglory of people, from the honor that people are bestowing on him, from public office, I guess, at that point. Now, there is a distinction to be made here. Christ was not running away from responsibility. There was already a king there. There was already the Roman Empire. There was already this responsibility. Someone was already taking care of it. Christ was running away from the glory and the forced position they wanted to put him in, but he's not running away from responsibility. On the other side, though, Jonah, he was running away from responsibility. There was no prophet in Nineveh. There was a hole there that someone needed to fulfill. And Jonah ran the opposite way. And that's a good lesson for us. We should never flee from responsibility. As a matter of fact, we should never even use prayer or fasting or the Bible or any of the holy exercises to run away from responsibility. Sometimes when we have a chore or we have to study or we have to go to work, oh, no, I have to pray. Khalas. Tasbah or liturgy or, well, that's not how it should be. We should never flee responsibility. Time for prayer is time for prayer. Time for studying is time for studying. Time for work is time for work. Saint Athanasius, who wrote the life of Saint Anthony, Vita Saint Anthony, he tells us this about the devils. He says, they arouse us from sleep to pray. So the devils used to come to Saint Anthony sometimes, tell him, what are you doing sleeping? Get up and pray. So he says, they arouse us from our sleep to pray, and this constantly hardly allowing us to sleep at all. But no heed must be paid to them, even if they arouse us to prayer. For they do not do this for the sake of piety or truth, but that they may carry simple despair. Life of Anthony 25. So this is saying Saint Anthony, the devils used to come to him when he's asleep. He's like, what are you doing sleeping? Get up and pray. Like, no. Right now it's time to pray. In a little bit it's going to be time for prayer. Right now it's time to sleep. In a little bit it's time to pray. In a little bit it's time to work. He knew his schedule. He knew how much he needed to sleep and how much he could be ascetic, how much he needs to pray. It's always good to be organized like that. We don't flee from prayer because we have things to do, but we don't flee from things to do and use prayer as an excuse. I think they both balance. We should never flee our responsibility, both spiritual or work-related. So what was he fleeing? He was fleeing that. The people that did not share his did not share his vision. Why was he fleeing? Christ had a vision, and he knew their hearts. He knew they were not really seeking him or wanting to make him king. It seemed like they wanted to make him king because they wanted free food. He gave us 5 loaves and 2 fish, and he gave us all this food. That's, if you make him king, maybe he's going to give us, it's going to be an open buffet or something. So that's exactly what he told them. When they found him, they said, Rabbi, when did you come here? That was their question. He ignored the question completely. And he told them, most assuredly, I say to you, you seek me not because you saw the signs, but because you ate the loaves that were filled. And I think there's another lesson here. It's kind of a side lesson. They asked the question, and he didn't have to answer. Christ knows his mission, and he knows his calling. And I think here there's a point. God is under no obligation to make sense to us. He's under no obligation to make sense to us. For them, it didn't make sense. You were on one side, and then now we see you on the other side. But that's not the question he wants to answer. God is under no obligation to make sense of us. Sometimes God has his own plan. He has a vocation. And of course, God will never force us to do anything. But I think everyone has a plan, and everyone has a calling. Sometimes we do like those people. We have our own agenda. We find a good servant. Oh, you should serve in this capacity, or you should join this clerical office, or you should do this, or you should do that. Everyone has a calling. Everyone has a calling. There's a calling to the presbyters, and there's a different calling for people who serve in Sunday school, and there's a different calling for deacons, there's a different calling for girls' choir, there's a different callings for teachers. Everyone has a calling. Just because someone is good at something doesn't mean, oh yeah, all of a sudden, no, you know what, you need to stay here, you need to take this clerical office, you need to do this, you need to do that. It's good, obviously, to have different motivations and look for needs where they are. But if someone already is at that responsibility, there's no reason to do like those people and kind of set our own agenda and tell God what to do. It doesn't really work like that. God doesn't have to make sense to us. God is under no obligation to make sense to us. Now, the final question is, to where is he fleeing? And the answer was to the mountain. He left them and he went to the mountain. And I think this reminds us to the Psalm 21 in the Gospel, in the Bible, where it says, I will lift my eyes to the mountain, to the hills, from where my help shall come. My help comes from the Lord. He's going to pray. He's teaching us to flee to prayer. When there is sin, when there's temptation, when there is different desires, when there's different people that are kind of taking us away from our calling, flee to prayer, flee to God. Abuna Mikhail actually gave a nice sermon a few weeks ago for those that was here. I think it's also on YouTube, if anyone missed it. But he was talking about fleeing from sin. Fleeing from sin. And I think that's very, very important. If you haven't heard it, I would urge you to go and hear it. It's very, very powerful. Flee from sin. Sirach actually tells us something very similar. He says, Have you sinned? Have you sinned, my son? Do so no more. But pray about... He says, Have you sinned, my son? Do so no more. But pray about your former sins. And praying, obviously, is fleeing to God. It's exactly what Christ did. He continues, Flee from sin as a snake, For if you approach sin, it will bite you. Its teeth are lion's teeth and destroy the souls of men. So he's telling us to flee from sin. And Christ shows us how to flee through prayer. Go to God. God is literally with his open arm. And that's what Christ did. He's teaching us to flee straight to God. It's almost the opposite of what Jonah did. Jonah fled to Tarshish as far away from God as he could. Christ is telling us, no, go towards God. As far towards God as you could. Even if you have to go on a mountain, be close to him. So to recap, we looked at Jonah and Christ, and they both fled, but in a very, very different way and for completely different intentions. Jonah was fleeing from the presence of God. From the very beginning of the book of Jonah, it's clear. And he was fleeing because God is good, because God is gracious, because God is merciful. That's his reason. Very confusing. But there were some negative emotions there that kind of blocked him from coming to God. And he was fleeing as far away from God as he could, to Tarshish. Christ, on the other hand, was fleeing from honor that people give, or vainglory, or pride, or arrogance. And he was fleeing because people, he knew their hearts, and he knew they had an agenda that was different from what he's called to do, different from his calling, different from his mission. And he's fleeing to the mountain, literally teaching us to flee straight to God, to prayer. Very different, even though the action is the same. So in the next few days, as we go through Jonah's fast, maybe we should think about 3 questions. Is there something we should be fleeing from? Is there some habit, sin, a group of people, something that we should be fleeing from that we're not doing it right now? And the opposite, is there something that we need to stop fleeing from? Is there something or someone that we're running away from that is actually there for our benefit that we're not doing? Whether it's prayer, whether it's a group of people that might bring us closer to Christ, whether it's the church, whether it's our father of confession. So the first question was, is there something that we should be fleeing from? And the second one, is there something that we shouldn't be fleeing from that right now we are? And the third is, to whom are we fleeing? Hopefully there is one right answer. It should be straight to God. Maybe let's think about those 3 questions. Is there something we should be fleeing from? Is there something we need to stop fleeing from? And to whom are we fleeing? May God grant us the strength and blessing in the upcoming fast of Jonah. May he teach us how to flee correctly towards him. And to God be the glory forever and ever.